In the year 869, in the marshlands surrounding the Iraqi port city of Basra, thousands of enslaved East Africans rose up against the Abbasid Caliphate in a rebellion that would last 14 years, reach the edges of Baghdad itself, and stand today as one of the largest and longest slave uprisings recorded anywhere in human history. Older than Spartacus's revolt was to ancient Rome, centuries before Haiti, centuries before any slave rebellion in the Americas. The people who rose up were known as the Zanj, and their descendants still live in Basra today. An estimated 500,000 to 2 million Afro-Iraqis carrying a documented history stretching back nearly 1,200 years. What's missing from that history isn't the record. It's the DNA study that should have confirmed it by now. The historical record surrounding the Zanj is unusually rich for a population this old, preserved not through oral tradition alone, but through detailed Arabic chronicles written by historians who lived through or shortly after the events themselves. Beginning in the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate imported enslaved East Africans, most likely originating from what is now Kenya, Sudan, and Ethiopia, to drain the salt-encrusted marshlands around Basra and cultivate sugarcane in brutal, large-scale agricultural operations. Conditions were severe enough, according to the Iraqi historian Ali al-Nashmi, that enslaved workers were reportedly fed bread made from date pits rather than proper food. In 869, the Zanj revolted under the leadership of a man known as Ali ibn Muhammad, seized control of large portions of southern Iraq, founded their own capital in the marshlands called al-Muqtara, and held off Abbasid forces for 14 years before the Caliphate finally crushed the rebellion in 883, killing thousands. The very word Zanj, used by medieval Arab geographers to describe the East African coast broadly, is the same root that gives us the modern name Zanzibar, the land of the Zanj. Following the revolt, the Caliphate reportedly abandoned large-scale plantation slavery in the region, though slavery itself in Iraq continued in other forms until the 19th century. Given how thoroughly documented this history is, chronicled by contemporary Arab historians, tied to a specific and famous rebellion, connected to well-established East African source regions, you'd reasonably expect this to be one of the more straightforward cases for population genetics to confirm. Most populations this channel investigates have to work around gaps in the written record. The Zanj history has almost the opposite problem, an unusually detailed archive with a scientific record that simply doesn't exist yet to match it. Before we get into that gap directly, it's worth sitting with how unusual it actually is. This isn't a population whose historical existence is doubted or debated in the way some other communities on this channel have been. Historians agree on the rough timeline, the source regions, the specific rebellion, even the etymology of the group's own name. If any population should have an easy, well-supported genetic study by now, connecting modern Afro-Iraqis to specific East African source populations, the way researchers have done for the Garifuna or the Maroons, this should be it. It doesn't exist. A search of published population genetics literature on Iraq turns up a reasonably active research field. Studies of YSTR markers across Iraqi Arab populations, X-chromosomal analyses for forensic databases, broader surveys of genetic diversity and gene flow across the Arabian Peninsula. One such study, examining genetic structure across Iraqi provinces, noted in passing that the African constituent in the population was minimal in southern and central provinces and close to zero further north. A finding that brushes right up against the Afro-Iraqi story without ever actually studying it directly. Not one of these studies isolates a self-identified Afro-Iraqi or Basra black community sample specifically. Not one connects the population descended from the Zanj rebellion to modern East African reference populations, the way similar research has been done for smaller, less historically documented communities elsewhere in the world. Here's a question worth sitting with before we speculate about why. If the historical record is this solid, why hasn't anyone run the numbers? The most likely answer has less to do with scientific difficulty and more to do with decades of instability that made this kind of specialized, community-specific research nearly impossible to conduct. Iraq spent much of the past 45 years under sanctions, war, or active conflict, conditions that make broad population genetics challenging enough, let alone the kind of targeted community sampling and international collaboration a dedicated Afro-Iraqi ancestry study would require. Layered on top of that is a pattern this channel keeps finding in different countries: a historically marginalized community without the institutional standing, census recognition, or organized advocacy infrastructure to attract outside research funding in the first place. The Zanj story is well documented because historians wrote it down centuries ago. It remains genetically unconfirmed because the infrastructure to study it never lined up with the decades when researchers might have gotten around to it. If a gap like that, a population with an unusually strong paper trail and an unusually empty genetic record, makes you wonder what else has been thoroughly written about but never actually tested, that's exactly the kind of blind spot this channel exists to chase down. So go ahead and subscribe now, because we keep finding versions of this same gap in different corners of the world, and the next one is a case you genuinely won't see coming. And if you know of a population whose history feels almost too well documented to have never been genetically studied, tell us in the comments, because that specific combination, rich history and empty science, has become one of the most reliable patterns this series keeps returning to. There's a further layer worth examining, because the Zanj rebellion itself is more historically complex than a simple story of enslaved workers rising against their masters. Historians studying the revolt note that Ali ibn Muhammad's forces eventually grew to include not only formerly enslaved East Africans, but also disaffected Bedouin tribesmen, other marginalized laborers, and even some soldiers who defected from Abbasid ranks, meaning the rebellion that gave the Zanj their lasting historical identity was, in practice, a broader coalition rather than a single ethnically uniform uprising. This complicates the clean version of the story in an interesting way. The population known today as descending from the Zanj inherited its name from a slave rebellion whose participants were already more mixed than the label suggests. A pattern this channel has now seen repeated in different forms, from Quilombo communities in Brazil to the founding population of Palmares itself. Names attached to resistance movements, it turns out, rarely stay as ethnically tidy as the movement's own founding myths remember them. Here is where an honest accounting has to include a real scholarly disagreement, rather than pretend the historical record is fully settled either. A minority but persistent line of scholarship argues that not all black Iraqis descend specifically from the 9th century Zanj slave trade. This view holds that some portion of Iraq's black population represents a much older, indigenous African presence in the Arabian Peninsula, tracing to Cushitic peoples connected to the ancient kingdom of Kush, present in the region since well before the Zanj rebellion and even before the rise of Islam. Under this framework, the Zanj trade would represent a third wave of African presence in Iraq, layered onto populations that were, in some form, already there. The more widely cited historical consensus places primary emphasis on the 9th century Zanj trade as the origin point. Neither position currently has genetic data to settle the disagreement because, as already established, the population hasn't been sampled with the specificity such a question would require. This is one gap this channel genuinely cannot close today, and it's more honest to say so than to pick a side the evidence doesn't yet support. It's worth placing this specific silence alongside the two other populations this channel has found in a similar position, because the pattern sharpens with each new example. Afro-Turks, concentrated along Turkey's Aegean coast, carry a documented Ottoman-era slave trade history with no dedicated genetic study to date. Jerusalem's African Quarter, a community with named ancestral villages and preserved family documents going back generations, has likewise never been the subject of a population genetics paper, despite sitting in one of the most heavily sampled regions on Earth. The Zanj make a third case, and arguably the most striking one, because unlike the other two, this population's founding event wasn't a quiet migration or a gradual settlement. It was a 14-year war large enough to threaten the capital of one of the most powerful empires in the medieval world, extensively documented by the empire's own historians. If any African-descended population's history was going to be considered dramatic enough, well-sourced enough, and historically significant enough to attract genetic research on the strength of the story alone, the Zanj rebellion would seem like the obvious candidate. It hasn't been enough, which says something less about the story itself and more about which stories research funding, political stability, and institutional attention have historically been willing to follow. For Afro-Iraqis today, concentrated heavily in Basra, particularly the Zubair district, sometimes referred to as the Harlem of Iraq, as well as Maysan and Dikar provinces. This unresolved scientific question exists alongside a very present set of social and political realities. Afro-Iraqis have documented long-standing experiences of marginalization in education, employment, and political representation, and in 2023, a government decision to allocate land specifically to dark-skinned citizens in Basra became the center of national controversy, with supporters framing it as overdue recognition and critics calling it politically motivated and racially divisive. Community advocates, including figures who have organized specifically around Afro-Iraqi political representation, have drawn explicit connections between their own civil rights efforts and figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Barack Obama, and George Floyd, describing a sense of transnational solidarity with African-descended movements elsewhere, even while operating in a domestic political context most outside observers know very little about. Cultural memory persists in more intimate forms as well. Some Afro-Iraqi communities in Basra have preserved collective dance and musical traditions, distinct from surrounding Iraqi Arab practices, forms community members describe as connected to their East African origins, performed at weddings and gatherings as a living link to a history otherwise documented only in medieval Arabic chronicles, rather than in the bodies of the people who carry it forward. What makes the Zanj case a genuinely distinct addition to everything this series has covered is the specific shape of what's missing. This isn't a population whose oral history needed genetics to rescue it from doubt, and it isn't a case where DNA revealed something nobody expected. It's a population with one of the best documented slave rebellions in recorded history, a rebellion still taught, still named, still tied to a word that gave the world the name Zanzibar, standing right next to a scientific record that simply never got written. The history survived in ink for 12 centuries. The genome, as far as published research currently shows, has never once been asked to confirm it. That gap won't close itself. And until a research team finally runs the study this population's own archive has been waiting on for over 1,000 years, the Zanj will remain exactly what they are right now. One of history's best documented rebellions, attached to one of its least studied genomes,